wondered if it's possible, can I start off by asking really like what a clinical trial is, and we can chat a bit about what we talked about last time and then go from there, if that's all right, please.
Yeah, so obviously clinical trial is essentially an experiment, okay? But of course it's an experiment that involves people, in this case, nearly always patients. And it is the main way by which we make progress in treating any disease, but in particular cancer. And really that's been the thing that's really revolutionized the treatment of cancer in the past sort of, I guess, sort of 30-year time frame, is our ability to do to perform clinical trials. And there are lots of different types of clinical trials. We're going to talk, I suspect, mainly about trials of drugs today, but of course you can do trials of operations, you can do trials of radiotherapy, you can do trials of tests, whether that's a screening test or a diagnostic test or a test to tell whether a treatment's working or not. So there's all sorts of trials that go on. And of course, they all take different shapes and sizes as well. Some trials are purely about safety. So it might be a trial of a drug that's never been used in humans before. And so you've got to, obviously there, you've got to be really, really careful, and you've got to start really cautiously. And the main thing you want to learn at that point actually is it's safe. Some trials are about simply asking the question, does a drug have any beneficial effects at all? And in that situation, quite often, all the patients will get the same treatment and you measure whether it works or not. More typically, I guess, trials are comparative trials. So the trial is asking, is this new treatment, or is this new treatment better than the current treatment? And so those are usually randomized trials where patients are randomly allocated to receive either a new treatment or the existing treatment. And then at the end of that trial, you compare the two to find out whether the new treatment genuinely is better in whatever way than the old treatment. Yeah, so, and I guess that the main message is that actually there's no two trials are the same. That would be wasteful. But there are all sorts of different shapes and sizes of trials as well. So it's quite quite a complex area if you're invited to take part in a trial.
Thank you, Rob. Tom, did you want me to add anything to it, or did you want me just to start asking questions or anything you'd like to talk about?
I think that trials are obviously designed to take the field forward, and there are risks and benefits associated in taking part in trials. And in some trials, the risks are greater than in other trials, and in other trials, the benefits are greater. And that's quite an important discussion with your doctor, because they should be relatively transparent about that. And the patient information sheet should be really explicit about that. The process of getting trials approved involves, in the UK and around the world, quite rigorous processes of assessment. And there are two main forms of assessment. One is a regulatory type assessment via an organisation called the MHRA, which looks at the trial conduct and the question and whether it's worthwhile and whether it's an appropriate question. And then there's also an ethical component, which has lay members and doctors, of course, which decide whether or not it's ethical to perform the question, which may be robust, but and that's where the patient information sheet is looked at very rigorously.
So Tom, I wonder, I actually see that there's a question that's just come up in the chat. And I was actually going to say, I wonder whether it would be good to lead off just talking about an example of a trial. And actually, the example I was going to use was Keynote 564. And somebody, as a participant in that trial, has actually just popped a question into the chat wanting to know what the update on that was. And I thought that's quite an interesting concept of a phase 3 trial, a very relevant trial in kidney cancer, because I think it explores a whole a whole new area, I guess, for a drug that we actually already know quite well. Do you want to just, because I know you were very involved in Keynote 564, I was involved a little bit as well. Do you want to just explain what this trial was about and what question it was asking, and then we can talk about what the answers to the question have been so far?
Yeah, well, Keynote represents a drug called pembrolizumab, and 564 is they've done 564 trials. This was the 564th of those. So there's nothing magic about the name. We know that individuals with operable kidney cancer, the standard treatment is to have surgery, which is either a partial or a complete nephrectomy.
So just to interrupt a bit, Tom, these are patients where the cancer has not spread, predominantly hasn't spread,
Yeah.
where you're aiming to get rid of all the cancer with an operation. The aim is to cure the disease, yeah?
Yeah, so what you would have is you'd have a CT scan that showed the cancer was isolated in the kidney. You may or may not have had a biopsy to show it's a kidney cancer, and at which point your doctors will sit down with you and say, the standard, if we cut this out, there's probably about a 60% chance the cancer won't come back, but there's a 40% chance it will come back. Now that changes depending on the size, etc. And I won't go into detail of the risk of relapse, but essentially almost with every nephrectomy, every surgical operation to remove the cancer completely, there's a possibility the cancer will have already spread. And let's say 40% of patients, the cancer comes back over a 5-year period, which is probably about right. The question that we have is, are there drugs we can give around the time of the operation, or specifically, can we give drugs after the operation to prevent the cancer coming back in the future? And the way you could determine that would be to a randomized trial of 1,000 patients, where half of them get the pembrolizumab, the immune therapy, the active drug that we know works well later in the disease, in advanced disease, and the other half get a placebo, or even don't get an operation. In this trial, it was a placebo trial, and we'll talk about placebo in a moment. Essentially, it's a saltwater drip. And the reason why you'd want to do that is sometimes doctors and patients have a bias if they know they're getting a therapy or they know they're not getting a therapy. So I think it's a more robust experiment, although there are ethical issues around placebo, which we can talk about in a minute. The question then is, you then have 1,000 patients who have had an operation. They've got a 40% chance of relapse. 500 of them have had the drug that we think may reduce the risk of relapse.
And Tom, so the standard treatment for these patients, at least before this trial, was no treatment, just wait and watch, yeah?
Yeah, it's an extraordinary state of affairs, because in almost all other cancers, we give radiotherapy, chemotherapy, targeted therapy, immune therapy, some form of treatment, hormone therapy in breast cancer, of course, around the time of the operation to reduce the risk of relapse. That's not the case in kidney cancer. As it currently stands in kidney cancer, you have an operation and then you're followed up with CT scans for 5 years in the hope that the cancer doesn't come back. And there is no intervention that we know that reduces the risk of the cancer coming back and extends survival. And so in this trial, the standard treatment was no treatment, which was placebo, and that was randomized against the pembrolizumab, which was an active treatment in advanced disease. And what we showed in this trial was, for those individuals who had the pembrolizumab compared to the placebo, there was about a 30% reduction, 32% reduction in the risk of the cancer coming back. And that was a median follow-up of about 2 years. And there was also, and that was statistically significant. So the trial was positive, and that's resulted in an approval. I'm sure it will result in approval in the United States, and it may or may not in Europe. The reason why it's debatable is there is a question still about whether just stopping the cancer returning is enough, and actually whether you actually have to show that in the end you can show patients living longer as well.
So I guess that's quite an important point, Tom, isn't it? So of course, just because a cancer has come back, it doesn't mean you can't treat it still, and that's where we conventionally give these treatments. So it's actually quite important, surely, to show that preventing recurrence actually means that patients are cured. It seems intuitive that it would do, but of course it's not necessarily true that a patient is cured just because you've delayed the return of the cancer, is it?
Yeah, and survival can sometimes take 5 or 6 years to achieve, to get that sort of survival result. And sometimes when the initial results, the progression-free survival results, are very impressive. And as in the case in this particular trial, there's a trend towards the survival results being right. So if the survival results continue as they are now, they will be significant in the future. So you'd say, well, actually, at the moment, it looks like there's going to be survival. We already know there's progression-free survival. Clearly, we know cancer returning is a bad thing. We all know that. Those patients are going to be on therapy for the rest of their lives. So everything's currently pointing towards it being a positive signal. And under those circumstances, I think the EMA and FDA will approve this. But what I would like to see, and what we will see, of course, is further follow-up on that survival signal to make sure that trend continues every year, to continue to show that, yes, it still looks like it's going to be positive in the future. And if there comes a time when, which is possible, when the curves go apart, they look like there's a benefit, but in the end, there's no difference, then we'd have to reassess. But the patients who I see at the moment, particularly with high risk, a 60 or 70% chance of the cancer coming back, those patients are looking to do something to try and reduce that risk, because you know when the cancer comes back, life becomes more tricky.
So just to be clear, because the questioner in the chat has asked, this is Jeff's question in the chat. Do we know, what do we know about, so right now we know that it's a positive trial because it's delayed recurrence, it's reduced the chance of recurrence.
Yes.
What do we know? Has it been shown to reduce the chance of dying of cancer yet?
So the answer is, statistically, it has not showed that yet, because it hasn't been powerfully tested statistically yet. So in clinical,
we need to wait longer to see how the patients do.
In clinical trials, we look, it's like, dare I say it, the end point is a bit like going to the casino. And what I mean by that is you have a series of chips and you say, at a specific time, I want to show this is better. Because if you do lots and lots and lots of analysis, there's a chance, eventually you'll shake a 6 on a dice. Eventually you'll shake a double 6. So you have to say, we are going to do the survival analysis after 5 years, and we will look at that time point. Now, up until then, you can go to the casino and watch other people, but it's only at that moment when it counts, because it stops what we call a type 1 error. And what that is having multiple goes because if you end up doing 20 trials, by luck alone, one of them will be positive.
So how many years have we followed up the trial so far, Tom?
So at the moment, we've got 2 years. I imagine we're going to need 5 years before we have that official survival look. But at the moment, the reduction in the risk of death associated with the pembrolizumab is about 40%. But only of the 1,000 patients in the trial, only 51 of those have currently passed away. And of those 51, 15 have been in the study arm and 35 in the control. So at the moment, everything looks like it's going the right way. But it's very premature to say there's definitely going to be a survival signal.
So the summary is the results are looking really good, but we probably need to wait another 3 years or so before we'll really know about the overall survival answer to this question.
Yes, but for patients in the interim, they don't have the luxury of waiting those 3 years.
Absolutely, yeah.
And those patients in the interim need to make a decision on what's best for them.
Yeah.
And in the United States of America, this is likely to be very widely given. And in Europe, I think we're more cautious, but I've seen 2 or 3 patients so far, and who have had, the individuals who are young, who happen to be young actually, but they've had aggressive disease and they've had a big cancer removed, and they want to try and reduce the risk of it coming back. And the problem, Rob, is that 10% of patients who take immune therapy have life-changing toxicity.
Yeah, and of course, for the 60% who are never going to relapse,
that's not.
We know there's only 40% we're going to relapse anyway. So the other 60%, we don't know who they are. But they can't benefit from the treatment. They can only get the side effects. And I guess that is the downside of this concept of what we call adjuvant therapy, when you give a drug after a successful operation to reduce the risk of relapse. And that's always the downside, isn't it? You've got to weigh up that risk of giving getting the side effects of the treatment for patients who will not benefit from it versus the relatively small proportion of patients who benefit. So Tom, there's another question in the chat. I don't know, Lucy, I know you've got some questions that were put before, but there was another question in the chat about a very specific trial.
Go for it, Rob. Yes,
yeah,
thank you.
And I've got to confess that I don't actually know the answer to this, but I suspect that Tom does. So this is, what do we have any results from the W041994 trial, which is atezolizumab plus cabozantinib?
Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about that in broad terms. The number one is that, again, it's an ongoing trial. It's recruiting well. It's open in many sites, including our own. And I'm sure we can put you in touch with someone if you wanted to get in touch with someone locally around it. One of the beauties of clinical trials is while they're ongoing, we don't know the results of them. Again, there would be a real bias if we knew that it was all going the right way. And it would be very hard to randomize patients if we knew the results of the trials while they were ongoing, because patients would come in and we say, oh, yes, this arm looks much better, but you've been randomized to the wrong one. So we have got into trouble with that before. Studies like Powles, where we knew the result, but we didn't have survival yet, we had to unblind the trial. So it's a really complex issue. What do we know about this trial? Well, we know cabozantinib is a good drug. It may even be the best VEGF TKI. We know atezolizumab, a PD-L1 inhibitor, is associated with durable remissions. When you combine those two drugs together, you can see quite impressive efficacy in a broad spectrum of cancers, including kidney cancer. At the moment, in the frontline space, we're giving ipi-nivo quite a lot. Patients are getting frontline immune therapy. Some are getting axi-pembro in Scotland. Everalimus less so, I hope, because it doesn't have a survival advantage. But when patients' cancers grow, the question is, what do we do next? Cabozantinib is the standard therapy, along with axitinib and other drugs. Lenvatinib and Everalimus can be given, and even pazopanib I quite like. So any VEGF TKI is reasonable. Cabozantinib may be the best of a crop. And for those patients, therefore, who have cancers have progressed on immune therapy, we're giving cabozantinib compared to cabozantinib plus continuing the immune therapy with atezolizumab. Now, it's a really important question. It's a question which I was sort of involved with at the beginning. It's not a super exciting question in as much as it's not a new drug or a new class of drug. It's unlikely to cure huge numbers of patients because I would imagine first-line immune therapy, if it's going to cure patients, would do it. There's no reason why switching to atezolizumab will suddenly cure 20 or 30% of patients. So I'm expecting the results of this trial to be modest. But the question really is, as with VEGF TKI, we don't stop that and let patients progress and die after first-line therapy. We continue that. The question is, should we be continuing immune therapy as well? And I'm expecting modest results. I wouldn't be surprised if they were positive.
But the straight answer to your question, Julie, is at the moment we don't have any results on that trial. But I think there is a message in there actually about how we actually do convey results of trials to participants, because if you don't know that the trial results haven't come out, you don't actually know whether that's, you don't know them because somebody hasn't told you or because nobody knows. So I don't know, Lucy, there are other questions coming in, but I know you had quite a few questions in advance, and it's important to give those people their fair share. Do you want to fire away with some of the pre-posed questions?
Of course I can. Thank you, Rob. So one of the first questions was, I live in rural Wales and I haven't got access to clinical trials. How can I help get more clinical trials coming to Wales rather than me having to do a big commute across somewhere like Birmingham or London, please?
Yeah. This is a really, I think this is a really important issue. And it's important for lots of reasons. It's important for you because you want to take part in a trial. It's actually really important for trials as well, because we know that the patients who take part in trials do not really represent the diversity of the population who have the disease. Now, clearly, biologically, you're probably quite similar living in rural Wales to someone who lives next door to Bart's Cancer Centre. But of course, there are other really important diversification issues, not least of which are things like race, and we know that there are real imbalances that the people in the populations in trials and the populations, the real life populations. So there's a danger we actually generate results that don't apply to patients in real life. So we do need to do better with that. But of course, it's a challenge because, firstly, actually just the infrastructure and the skills and the cost of setting up centres that can do trials, there are economies of scale. So it's always going to be really difficult to have every trial available at everybody's cancer centre, everybody's local hospital. So there's no easy answer to your question, but we do need to work better nationally. So there are national organizations responsible for ensuring that there is not necessarily equitable. We would like it to be equitable, but there is access to trials for patients throughout the country, irrespective of where you live. That's in England is the NIHR, in Scotland it's the Chief Scientist Office. I can't actually remember the name of the organisation in Wales, I'm afraid. But so there is a mission to try and improve trials access. But unfortunately, I think it's unlikely that every single trial is ever going to be available in every single hospital. So what can you do? Well, you can get involved. So the NIHR is part of the organisation, but there's also the NCRI, which is the National Cancer Research Institute, and that's an organisation of people. It's researchers, but it has a very strong patient and public representation group within it, and we're responsible for trying to generate new trials, get funding for new trials which are applicable across the nation, and so actually get involved and state your claim and make the rural voice heard, because actually it's really important, and that way we will get better trials that will be suitable for these sorts of environments, and it will also helps get the resources put in place, get the right people in place to do that. But Rob, it's not going to be quick.
Rob, is kidney cancer going in the right direction for clinical trials in the UK compared to 5 years ago?
Yeah. So I think if we look at from the oncology perspective, that is what you and I do, the drugs essentially. I think that a lot of the trials we're doing are becoming quite specialized and more applicable in specialist centers. So I don't think we don't have many trials which are easy to do in small centres. We do have one. We've got the Rampart trial, which again I know you're very involved in, Tom, which is actually another adjuvant trial, again looking at this immunotherapy question in the post-operative setting. So it's a very similar trial, in fact, to Keynote 564. And that's a trial which, by my view, could probably be done in any centre that treats kidney cancer. And that's looking for thousands and thousands of patients over many years, isn't it, Tom? So there are options there, but I think I think we do need to. But the problem is that there's always a conflict as well, because we can come up with a very broad, pragmatic trial. You take it to the funders, and they say, "Well, that's not sexy enough," or it's not got enough translational endpoints, not enough laboratory research in that, and these are the things, of course, which make it really difficult to do these trials in small centres. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Tom?
I mean, I think COVID has put a dent in some of our trial work. I think some of our trial infrastructure is not as strong as it was 10 years ago in cancer. I think
but it's really strong in COVID, interestingly.
Yeah, which is probably a good thing. Probably a good.
The UK has led the world in doing big pragmatic trials that can be done in small hospitals in COVID.
Very good point.
We can learn.
So there are issues about how we learn from that and what we can do, and I think the trial group in the UK is at a bit of a crossroads in kidney cancer, because I think we're finding it harder to do the more complex trials, and as you say, some of the more pragmatic questions are not being focused on, and so we are going to need, as a group, to think really carefully about how we and what we want to offer our patients and what our patients really want, because at the moment the UK recruitment is not in kidney cancer is not as good as it is in Spain or France as it currently stands. And that's a discussion that I think we do need to have.
Yeah. So there's another sort of related question in the chat here, which is about getting information about trials. So this is a question from Georgina. Can there be better access and information for trials at hospitals after diagnosis in a hospital? I did my own research for my dad. Many people will be unaware of any live trials after diagnosis. And I think this is a really important point is, often there are trials out there, but if nobody presents it as an option, that's a barrier to access to the trial. And I think, again, this is something that patients can do and that organizations like KCK can do, is ask your doctor, okay? Your doctor may say, I'm afraid the chances are if your doctor is running a trial that you're suitable for, he or she will probably offer it to you. But the chances are there's a trial out there that they're not directly involved in that they may be able to refer you to. And so actually by continually asking, is there a trial? Then that does two things. Firstly, it does force the doctor to ask themselves the question and maybe go out and find an answer. And maybe even if that hospital's not doing the trial, there's a hospital nearby. I appreciate a lot of you don't have hospitals nearby. Rural Wales, for example, don't have a choice of hospitals that they could refer you to. The other thing it does do is, of course, it just highlights the fact that maybe we should be doing a trial for this group of patients. And so if you continually ask the question, it does make a difference.
I agree with that. Rob, I'm just going to start we've just started a Bart's Health ECMC website, Twitter account. Maybe we should join a Bart's and Glasgow one together.
Well, there is the ECMC trial finder, isn't there? Is that available? Is that open? Is that accessible to patients, or is that just accessible to doctors? Because the point is, there are systems out there that collate all the trials. So even if I don't know the answer to the question, I should be able to go and hunt it down for you.
So can I just interrupt? Can I ask a question? Could you please explain what that is, Tom, in ESC?
So what we're doing is
we're to explain what Twitter is to me as well, Tom.
What we're doing is we've started last week an ECM. So Bart's Health, our hospital, has an experimental cancer medicine centre, and that experimental cancer medicine centre has found it difficult to broadcast the work that it's doing because you can broadcast it to friends and colleagues, but not to patients. And so what we're now doing is we're now highlighting ongoing trials and results on Twitter, which we hope will become a forum for patients to go to. And as you know, we've got an interest in kidney and bladder cancer, as well as lung and breast cancer. And we're going to be broadcasting the trials and the work that we're doing on that. But maybe, Rob, we should join together with the Beatson and have a joint one. So we could have and you could have access and I could have access, and we could be broadcasting what we're doing together.
Well, we can, and I think part of the problem is with this is that things are changing all the time in terms of trials open, trials closed, and it is actually really difficult. It's difficult enough for me to keep up with it at times, and so it's. I think you just have to be a little bit careful that any system that's there genuinely is being kept up to date, and you still ask the question, okay? Because it's actually quite difficult. I find it quite difficult to navigate some of these sort of databases that have all the trials on, because it's difficult to work out whether it really is a trial for you. So I'm not sure it's an easy solution. But yeah, I think it's something that as a nation we need to try and do better.
Well, Rob, I'm going to kick it off, and I'm going to let you know how I get on. And if it works really well, I'll invite you to take part.
Okay. Lucy, where do we want to head next?
Can I just ask, related to what we just spoke about, can I ask, how can we help you that trial register? Could we help you collaborate it, or anything we can do? Because obviously we want more trial access to all the patients.
I think what we should be doing is broadcasting to you the key big trials. So at the moment, there's an adjuvant trial called Rampart. There's going to be a first-line trial, a metastatic trial, called which is looking at lenvatinib and pembrolizumab in the UK. At the moment in England, you can't get access to drugs like that in the frontline setting, and so that's really attractive, and you can help us broadcast that. I think those trials that are, those big trials which are open in many sites, which are the ones that are worthwhile broadcasting perhaps the loudest. And the reason why is most people can get to if they really want, I know it's hard, but a huge percentage of the UK population is close to a big city. Not everyone, but broadcasting a single arm trial from Manchester very loudly, as valuable as that is, 70% of the UK population is never going to be able to get, or 80% is never going to be able to get there. Whereas if it's open in 10 or 15 sites in the UK, we then maybe 80 or 90% might be able to get there. And if that's the case, broadcasting that loudly is worthwhile.
Okay, so if I've got a patient that's got medullary cancer, and obviously it's a very rare type, is there going to be more clinical trials for that and for other rarer types of kidney cancer in the UK? Because obviously there's not a lot. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Let me take that on, Lucy. So
Thank
this
you,
is really difficult, and we have to put our hands up and say, from a global perspective, we're not focusing well on these rarer cancers, and it's unlikely that we will. While we've got tumours like bladder cancer and pancreas cancer, which are very common, where survival remains a year and we're really struggling, a lot of the effort is going into those. Now, you can turn around and say, well, how are we leaving these patients behind from a trial perspective? And the answer is, I obviously know a little bit about medullary cancer, and the answer is the data is incredibly sparse. And should we be finding efforts, and should we be putting efforts into those cancers? I think that we have to have that discussion around that. But at the moment, the best approach for these rarer cancers is to go to the bigger cancer centres and look for molecular targeted type trials. So you end up getting your tumour sequenced, you have a DNA alteration to protein X and Y, and then you take part in a study targeting that type of protein. I'm afraid that for those rarer cancers, it's difficult. What I can say positively in kidney cancer is papillary renal cancer was until recently part of those rarer cancers that essentially we left behind. But you'll be aware, in the UK at the moment, we've got a trial called SUMITA, which is looking at savolitinib plus durvalumab. That's MET inhibition targeted trial randomized in this rarer cancer. There's also a SUNNY forecast, which is a randomized trial again. So we've actually, and of course there was the PAPMET trial, cabozantinib versus sunitinib, that came out recently. So the good news is, as we make more progress from a global perspective, we're drawing those rarer cancers into the wider net, and we are making progress in that respect. Obviously, collecting duct tumours, medullary tumours, very, very difficult, rare, and at the moment we're struggling.
Yeah, I think we have to, so we've got to sometimes take a step back, is because clinical trials, what they do is that they generate knowledge, and that knowledge helps us decide how best to treat individual patients. We have to accept that one of the failings of the current sort of paradigm of doing these big randomized phase 3 trials is it will never answer the questions about very, very rare cancers. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't need to seek information about how best to treat those, but we sometimes have to take alternative approaches to finding that information, such as the way that Tom's explained. The other really important thing is just sharing information. And one of the great things about the information, just the advent of email, we were actually having an email correspondence just with all the oncologists who treat kidney cancer in Scotland have a group sort of email, and almost exactly, it was actually a patient with a collecting duct tumor. Somebody wanted to know, what's the latest on this, and so we all chip in and answer that. When we get that discussion, almost turned around overnight. And so actually just sharing of that views, those experiences, and that consensus can sometimes be, although it's not a formal way of establishing evidence, it can really help better understand how to treat individual patients. But we do have to accept that the conventional trials model doesn't fit every scenario, unfortunately.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. Should we go and answer the question? If you're happy to answer the questions in the Q&A, please. Can you see those, guys?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of questions here.
Yes.
We've covered a couple of them already. Some of them are very, I'm not ignoring, but some of them are very specifically just not specifically about trials, and just because people wanted to hear about trials, we'll try and look at those. So there's one about so I think I'm going to answer a question to this. It's specifically about the the trial of this drug called belzultifan, and it's about the question about the trial comparing belzultifan with everolimus. Well, I'm fairly certain that we don't have that trial still recruiting, so we don't have any results on that yet, do we, Tom? But
it is still recruiting.
Do you want to maybe just tell us a little bit about belzultifan, because this is a drug that's not routinely in use yet, but it's an interesting new drug, which is a whole new concept in drug treatment in kidney cancer.
So there's a chap called Bill Kalin who won a Nobel Prize recently for the development of a molecule which was essentially a transcription factor called which is HIF. HIF2 alpha sits at the middle of the angiogenic pathway that we know is really crucial for the development of clear cell kidney cancer. And we target at the moment VEGF with cabozantinib and sunitinib and pazopanib and axitinib and etc. This targets an upstream part of that, which is the transcription factor HIF and HIF2 alpha. And his group developed drugs, and that was then more widely developed. And we have single agent data suggesting those patients with really aggressive disease have about a 20% response rate to belzultifan targeting HIF. It's a clean drug with very few side effects. And so it's quite attractive. It's being taken forward in a plethora of different randomized trials, the first of which is this Merck 005 study, which looks at belzultifan as an oral drug versus everolimus, which is an slightly old-fashioned standard therapy for patients who have tried many other therapies. And if that trial is positive, and we all hope it will be, it's an open label study, by the way, and it will need a survival signal. If that trial is positive, it will open the door to many other trials. And in fact, there's a frontline trial that will open in the UK. It's open in France and Spain and America already, which will look at HIF with lenvatinib and pembrolizumab versus lenvatinib and pembrolizumab to see if triplet therapy in the first line therapy is better than doublet therapy. So it's a whole new chapter of renal cancer, and it's coming to the UK soon.
Yeah, so I mean, we already know from non-randomized trials that this drug causes tumor shrinkage in some patients, don't we, Tom? So
yes.
It's not so we're now at the stage of doing the randomized trials to see whether it's actually better than current treatment, in this case, everolimus. So it is exciting because, the truth is we congratulate ourselves. We made a lot of progress over the last 10 years, but fundamentally, we're still really dealing with just different forms of immune therapy and different forms of vascular endothelial growth factor targeted therapies. But this is a new type of drug, so it does potentially bring in a completely different approach to treating kidney cancer, and that's why I think this is an exciting development in kidney cancer. So thanks for raising that one. So there will be other trials about belzultifan. Loads more questions coming through, and some very helpful comments. Any particular questions from this, Lucy? I'm trying to read.
Yeah, one question I would really like, because I've had this same questions about like 4 times. If I have cryoablation, will it affect my immunotherapy? And can I have them together?
No, I wouldn't focus on it too much. So I'd look at the two processes as distinct.
Okay. Brilliant. Perfect.
There's certainly no evidence that it would have a harmful effect on it.
Yeah. And talking of harmful effects, I've got another question is it okay for me to keep having more and more scans? Because obviously sometimes with clinical trials, you'll be scanned more. Obviously.
So when you take part in a trial, obviously, often the key endpoint is to understand whether the cancer is growing or whether it's relapsed. And of course, the main tool we use to establish that is the CT scan. And I'm sure many of you on the call have had dozens of CT scans. I've had a couple myself, actually, for various reasons. These tests are rife in medicine and are very commonly used. But of course, they do involve X-rays, and X-rays are radiation. Now, it's actually, although it's a much bigger dose of radiation with a CT scan than with just a simple chest X-ray, actually the doses there are still very modest and regulated. Now, the risk from radiation, of course, is that it can cause cancer. That's the real risk with radiation. And undoubtedly, the more radiation you have, the higher the risk of developing another cancer. But that risk is with a CT scan is still very, very small. And I guess the other point is that those cancers take usually around about 15 to 20 years to develop. So you're actually looking at a risk. If you have an overdose of radiation now, the risk is going to be felt probably many years later. Now, of course, when we're doing trials in patients with cancer, the problem is much more urgent than that 15 to 20 year time frame. And so generally speaking, the modest risk involved with the radiation is almost definitely balanced by the potential benefits, not only to the individual patient, but of course then to future patients of doing the research. But we do try to minimize unnecessary exposure to radiation. Tom talked about the ethical review process. For any trial, it also has to go through a very specific medical physics review, which is asking exactly that question: how much excess radiation is the patient going to get because they're taking part in the trial, and does that risk and is that risk excessive? And if the answer is it's excessive, the trial won't be able to proceed with that design. You'll have to change the number of scans.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. So since our last webinar, is there anything exciting that's happened to the world of clinical trials, or any clinical trials that are going to come through in the near future at all?
So you've mentioned a trial already, Tom, which is this frontline trial. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think that's probably the main sort of upcoming study that might be applicable to people.
So in the UK, it's going to open in about 10 centres. It will be the bigger centres, I would imagine. And it's for those individuals who have got cancer that's spread beyond the kidney, advanced clear cell kidney cancer, and have not received previous therapies. And for those patients with advanced disease who have not received previous therapies, those individuals will be randomized to receive the standard of care, which is lenvatinib and pembrolizumab. And you might be aware that that's the most recent combination which has been shown to have a survival signal in kidney cancer. The response rate of lenvatinib and pembrolizumab is very high at 74%, and the progression-free survival is 23 months. Remember, the overall survival 10 years ago was only 12 months, so the progression-free survival is now double the old overall survival. So huge progress with this.
That first figure, Tom, that 73% response rate, what that means is that 73% of the patients who have the drug get significant tumor shrinkage as a result of having that drug. So nearly three quarters of the patients having tumor shrinkage. So it is a very potent combination.
And that's going to be compared to two new combinations, both with lenvatinib and pembrolizumab as the backbone. But one is you add in a drug like ipilimumab, a second immune drug, and the other is you add a drug in, the belzutifan, the HIF drug. So it's doublet therapy versus two novel triplets, in the hope that we're going to cure more patients. It's going to require 1,200 patients, and we hope that we hope to recruit about 70 patients from the UK.
But of course, it will be really important there if you're adding in, first of all, the standard treatment is 2 drugs. If you're adding in a third drug, it doesn't take a doctor to tell you the more drugs you give, the higher the risk of side effects, surely, Tom. So it's going to be really important, surely, to balance up that additional, whether that additional risk, those additional side effects actually justify any additional benefits seen, surely.
Yep, but we know in testis cancer and in lymphoma, and most recently in prostate cancer, triplet therapy appears better than doublet therapy. It cures more patients. And so there is going to be a discussion, of course, around the benefit risk profile associated with it. But as it stands, we still have got a lot of work to do in kidney cancer. We're not yet curing the majority of the patients. We're some distance from that. And these will be steps in that direction.
Thank you. Another question in the chat was that I've had surgery and I wasn't offered a clinical trial. Should I have been, please?
So the answer is no. I don't think you should be offered a clinical trial. I think we'd like to be in a scenario where everyone is offered a clinical trial, but I don't think it's a should answer yet. I'd like that to be the case. It's what I do for a living, and Rob's the same. So we'd like that, but it's not unethical not to offer patients clinical trials. I think it's one of those things, I don't know, it's hard for me to say because it's what I do, but it's one of those things that I think it's a mark of an institution that's dynamic and doing the best it can. But you can offer world-class care without clinical trials, and you can offer lousy care with clinical trials. So I think it's really important that you're getting great standard therapy, and clinical trials I would see as the icing on the cake, which is great, but it's not a should, it's a would be nice, I think.
Thank you,
I'm aware
Tom.
that Tom has to go now, and I also have another meeting in a few minutes. So I think we're going to have to wind up, Lucy, unless there are any pressing last questions.
No, all I was going to say is to anybody, on our website, you can search clinical trials. And if anyone's ever got any questions on clinical trials, you can use our website. You can always ring the care line. And also to say to both of you, a huge thank you for everything you do to support us. And again, for using up your time today to do this webinar. And thank you to everyone joining the webinar as well.
There's lots of really supportive comments coming through in the chat as well, and that's I'm sure greatly appreciated. There's some specific compliments to your cats in the past as well.
Thank you, and I apologise we weren't able to answer all your questions. If there's anything pressing, please email or call the care line, and we will do our very best to answer those as well. And thank you all for attending, and take care.
Thank you, everybody.
All of us at Kidney Cancer UK. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Lucy.